That was the sentence that changed everything. That was week 2. I remember sitting in my car after that meeting, staring at the steering wheel, thinking, did I actually just hear that? From a man who had been in the building for 11 days. I had been with that company for 9 years. 9 years. I started as a junior account coordinator right out of college, worked my way up to senior operations manager, built the client services team from 4 people to 14. I knew every system, every client quirk, every workaround that kept things running when things inevitably broke. The company wasn't perfect, no company is. But it was mine, in the way a place becomes yours when you've bled for it long enough. His name was Conrad. Conrad Hale. He came in as the new VP of Client Operations after our previous VP, a woman named Joan, retired after 22 years. Joan was the kind of leader who remembered your kids' names and also absolutely would not let you get away with sloppy work. She raised the bar while making you feel like you could clear it. When she announced her retirement, I cried in the bathroom. I'm not embarrassed about that. Conrad was brought in from a consulting firm out of Atlanta. I know because I Googled him the day HR sent out the announcement email. His LinkedIn had a lot of words, transformational, synergy-driven, change agent, and not a lot of specifics. No companies I recognized, no tenure longer than 2.5 years anywhere. But I told myself I was being unfair. People deserved a chance. I would give him one. The first week he was fine. Quiet, almost. He sat in on meetings, took notes, nodded a lot. I thought, okay. He's watching, learning the landscape. Good sign. Week 2 is when it started. He called me into his office, Joan's old office, which he had already rearranged, the plants gone, the framed client thank you letters taken down, and told me he wanted to reimagine the operational flow. I asked him what that meant. He said he was going to restructure how our team interfaced with clients, starting with eliminating what he called legacy communication loops. I said, "Can you be more specific?" He looked at me like I'd asked him to explain gravity. "The old ways of doing things," he said. "We're going to move faster, be more agile." I managed to keep my face still, barely. Those legacy communication loops he wanted to eliminate were the weekly check-in calls we did with every major account. I had built that system. It was the reason our client retention rate was 94% over the past 4 years. Clients stayed because they felt like we actually talked to them. Conrad wanted to replace the calls with an automated status portal that clients could log into themselves. He called it empowering the client. I told him some of our clients were regional logistics companies run by people in their 60s who did not want to log into a portal. They wanted to talk to someone. He told me I was underestimating them. That was week 3. By week 6, I had watched him override 3 of my team's recommendations, ignore a concern I flagged in writing about a contract renewal that had a tight deadline, and tell one of my coordinators, Danielle, who had been there 4 years and was one of the sharpest people on my team, that her process for onboarding new accounts was outdated and inefficient. He didn't offer an alternative. He just told her it was wrong. Danielle came to my office afterward and sat down across from me and didn't say anything for a second. "Is he going to be like this?" she finally asked. I didn't have a good answer. The automated portal launched in month 3. Within 6 weeks, 2 clients called us directly, the old-fashioned way, to say they were confused about their account status and hadn't been able to get a response through the portal. One of them, a mid-size freight company we'd had for 6 years, sent a formal letter of concern. I brought it to Conrad. He said the clients needed time to adjust. One of our account managers, a guy named Theo who'd been there 7 years and handled our 3 largest accounts, asked to meet with Conrad privately to discuss the situation. I don't know exactly what was said in that meeting, but Theo came out looking like he'd swallowed something bad. He told me later that Conrad had said, "If you're not comfortable with the direction, maybe this isn't the right environment for you." Theo had a mortgage, a 2-year-old. He went quiet after that. We all did a little. I kept documentation. I don't know exactly when I started, maybe around month 2, but I kept a running log in a personal notebook. Dates, what was said, what decisions were made, what the outcomes were. Not because I had a plan, more because things were happening fast enough that I needed somewhere to put them. Month 4, Conrad restructured the team reporting lines without telling me. I found out because my coordinator Ryan came to ask me a question about a client and mentioned, almost as an aside, that he'd been told he now reported directly to Conrad for certain projects. I had not been informed. When I asked Conrad about it, he said it was a temporary realignment and that I would be looped in when appropriate. I went home that night and made dinner and sat at the kitchen table for a long time not eating it. The thing about a situation like that is that you keep thinking it's going to level out. You keep thinking that surely someone upstairs is seeing this. Surely the numbers will start telling the story. But Conrad was good at one thing, and that was managing up. Every meeting with the executive team, he had slides. Beautiful slides. He talked about transformation timelines and phased implementation and change management friction. That last one was his explanation for why clients were unhappy. Not the portal. Not the loss of personal contact. Friction. As if the clients were the problem. I started sleeping badly somewhere around month 5. Month 5 was also when we lost the freight company, the one that had sent the formal letter. After 6 years, they cited communication breakdowns and lack of account continuity. Conrad sent an internal email calling it an expected attrition during a transition period. I read that email 3 times. I still couldn't make it make sense. Around that time, a woman named Sophia, our senior account director, 13 years with the company, one of the most respected people in the building, started having lunch with me regularly. We hadn't been particularly close before, but she started sitting down across from me in the break room and saying things like, "I need to talk to someone who isn't going to tell me I'm imagining things." She wasn't imagining things. There were 8 of us who started talking. Not all at once, gradually. In parking lots, in the break room before Conrad arrived in the mornings, in texts after work hours. Sophia, Theo, Danielle, Ryan, an account manager named Felix who'd been there 10 years, a coordinator named Priya who was 3 years in but sharp enough that she'd already been promoted twice, a senior analyst named Wes, and me. Nobody said the word resign for a while. We mostly just talked about what was happening, compared notes, realized that Conrad was telling different people different things, and that the inconsistency wasn't accidental. Theo had been told the portal changes were temporary. I had been told they were permanent. Danielle had been told her role was being elevated. She hadn't seen any evidence of that. It was Felix who first said it. We were standing in the parking garage after work one evening. 4 of us, not all 8, and Felix said, "I've started looking." Nobody acted surprised. "I've been here 10 years, he said. "I have never once dreaded coming in. Now I sit in the parking lot for 5 minutes every morning before I can make myself go inside." I knew exactly what he meant. I had started doing that too. The conversation shifted after that. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about whether surviving was worth it, and whether we even could survive given the direction things were going. 3 clients had expressed concern in writing by that point. Our retention numbers, which had been my quiet source of pride for years, were starting to slip. Conrad's response to each client concern was a template email that looked personalized but wasn't. Month 6, I updated my resume for the first time in 4 years. It felt like admitting something, but it also felt like finally being honest. The thing that crystallized it for me, the thing that turned a slow, painful drift into a decision, happened in month 7. Conrad held an all-hands meeting for the client operations team. He stood at the front of the room with a slide deck and announced a new client engagement framework. It was, as far as I could tell, the portal system rebranded with new terminology. But the part that broke something in me was when he said on the record, in front of everyone, that the client satisfaction issues we'd been experiencing were the result of complacency that had been allowed to develop over many years under previous leadership. previous leadership was Joan. Joan, who had given 22 years to that company. Joan, who had personally flown to a client's facility in Ohio during a crisis so that the client could look someone from our company in the eye. Joan, who had trained half the people in that room. Nobody said anything in the meeting. You don't in those moments, but I looked around the room and I saw what it did to people's faces. Theo was staring at the table. Sophia had the particular stillness of someone who is making a decision. Danielle looked like she was holding her breath. I texted Sophia that night. Just, "Are you okay?" She replied, "No." "Are you?" "Me? No." "Her? Then I think we need to have a real conversation." We did. All 8 of us within the next 2 weeks, not in the office, at Sophia's house one Saturday morning. Sophia had printed out copies of the employment market data for our industry. She'd done actual research, because Sophia doesn't do anything halfway, and we talked for 3 hours. Nobody pressured anyone. That was the rule. Whatever anyone decided, that was their decision. But by the end of it, all 8 of us had made up our minds. We decided on timing. We decided we would each submit our resignations on the same day, within 1 hour of each other, so that no one could be quietly managed out or talked down before the others knew. We decided we would each write our own letter, not coordinated content, because that wasn't the point. The point was honesty, but we would each say something specific about why we were leaving. Sophia, because she had the most institutional knowledge, wrote a memo, a separate document from her resignation letter addressed to the COO and the board. It was 9 pages long. It documented the client satisfaction decline with dates and data. It documented the specific decisions that had contributed to it. It included the concerns that had been raised internally and ignored. It was not angry. It was careful and thorough in the way that Sophia is careful and thorough about everything. She sent it 30 minutes before we submitted our letters. I submitted mine at 9:17 on a Tuesday morning. Effective in 2 weeks. I kept it professional. I said I had valued my 9 years and I believed the organization's direction had shifted in ways that were incompatible with my professional values. Short, clear, true. By 10:22, all 8 letters were in. I didn't see Conrad's face in that moment. I was at my desk doing my work. But Priya sat close enough to his office that she could hear things, and she texted the group at 10,008. It just said, "He's talking to HR." Then, a few minutes later, "I can hear him from here." Conrad had not, based on everything we could piece together afterward, anticipated that more than one person might leave. He had certainly not anticipated 8. The client operations team had 14 people. 8 resignations meant we were handing in over half the team at once. HR asked to speak with each of us, individually, same day. I sat across from our HR director, a woman named Carol who had been navigating corporate situations for 30 years and had a face that gave nothing away, and she asked me if there was anything that might change my decision. I said no. She asked if I would be willing to share my specific concerns. I said I had included them in my letter and I was happy to elaborate, and I did. I was not dramatic. I just talked. I talked for about 20 minutes. She took notes. At the end, she thanked me and I went back to my desk. I learned later that 6 of the 8 had similar conversations with her. Theo's lasted 40 minutes. What happened next happened faster than I expected. By end of week, Conrad had been placed on administrative leave. Not fired, placed on leave, which is the corporate way of saying they're figuring out what to do with you. The COO sent a message to the full team acknowledging that there were concerns that needed to be addressed and that leadership was committed to hearing them. The freight company that had left 6 months earlier, the one that had been with us for 6 years, reached out. They didn't come back right away, but they reached out. They asked if there were changes being made. Of the 8 of us, 5 got job offers within 6 weeks. Felix had actually been in late-stage interviews already, which none of us had known. He was gracious about it, didn't make anyone feel slow. Priya got recruited by a former client. Danielle took 2 weeks off first. She said she needed to remember what it felt like to not dread Mondays, and then started applying. I took a position at a smaller firm, a regional company, 14 employees in client services. My first week, my new manager sat down with me and said, "Walk me through how you've handled client retention in the past." And she listened, actually listened, took notes, asked follow-up questions. It sounds simple. It wasn't something I had experienced in a while. Conrad was let go 3 weeks after administrative leave. I know because Sophia, who maintained contact with Carol from HR, got a call. No severance dispute, no extended negotiation. He was gone. The company brought in an interim VP from within the team while they ran a proper search. I heard later, through the industry grapevine, our sector is smaller than people think, that he had a similar situation at the company before ours. Not identical, but similar. A team that had eroded, numbers that had slipped, an abrupt departure. It made me wonder how many companies had just quietly absorbed the damage and moved on without saying anything, leaving him free to do it again somewhere new. There's something I think about now, from the distance of a year out. I stayed too long. Not 9 years. That wasn't too long. But month 5, month 6, I knew. I had the data, I had the documentation. I kept telling myself it would level out, that someone would notice, that the numbers would eventually force the issue. And they did, eventually. But I lost sleep over it. I watched good people shrink down into quieter, more careful versions of themselves. Danielle, who had been one of the most energetic people on my team, started emailing instead of stopping by my office, because stopping by meant potentially running into Conrad in the hallway. You can survive a bad manager. People do it every day, but you pay for it in ways that don't show up on any balance sheet. What I'm glad we did, what I would do again, is that we were honest. Every single one of us. We wrote what we actually meant. We didn't soften it into nothing or dress it up in corporate language. Carol read all 8 letters and she told Sophia, months later, that it was the most consistent and specific documentation she had seen in 30 years of HR work, that the letters, combined with Sophia's memo, made it impossible to look the other way. So if you have ever sat in a parking lot, dreading the building, if you have ever watched someone take credit for your work in a meeting and done the math on whether saying something is worth what it will cost you, if you have ever felt your shoulders go up the moment a certain person walks into a room, I'm not going to tell you what to do, that's not my call. But I will tell you that 8 people decided the same thing, independently, on a Saturday morning at a kitchen table, and that it mattered. Not just to us. It mattered. And Conrad Hale learned that my way or the highway only works until everyone takes the highway. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened. A year out. Things look different than they did when I was in the middle of it. What I keep coming back to is this. Conrad didn't fail because he was unlucky. He failed because of a very specific chain of choices he made, one after another, that each had a cost, and he never paid attention to the bill accumulating. He chose to come into a functioning team and treat experience like a liability. He chose to dismiss concerns that were raised professionally and in good faith. He chose to credit himself for things he hadn't built and blame others for problems he had created. Every one of those choices pushed people a little further toward the door. Not dramatically, quietly. The way a relationship erodes, not in one fight, but in 100 small moments where someone decides it isn't worth trying anymore. And here's what I think about when I think about Theo, who sat at that table for 7 years and managed our most important accounts without ever once asking for more than he was given. Theo went quiet for months. He had a mortgage, a toddler, real things to protect. And even Theo, at some point, decided that the cost of staying had become higher than the cost of leaving. That's not nothing. That's the moment when a patient person finally runs out of patience, and it means the situation has gotten genuinely bad. Sophia did something that I think took a particular kind of courage. She sat down and wrote 9 pages of careful, documented truth. Not venting. Not accusations. Evidence. She could have just submitted her letter and walked. She had every right to. Instead, she chose to make it harder for the same thing to happen to the next team, in the next building, under the next version of Conrad. That took integrity that I'm not sure I would have had on my own. Watching her do it made me want to be more like her. I think about what I would tell my younger self, the one who first walked into that office 9 years ago. I would tell her that competence protects you less than you think it does, and that documentation protects you more. I would tell her that the people who go quiet around a bad leader aren't weak. They're calculating, and they're usually right about what it will cost them to speak up. I would tell her that the moment you start dreading a building you used to love, that feeling is real information, and it deserves to be taken seriously. I stayed through months 5 and 6 because I kept hoping someone above Conrad would notice. Someone did, eventually. But eventually is expensive. You pay for it in sleep, in the way your shoulders feel on Sunday nights, in the version of yourself that starts to shrink a little to take up less space around a person who makes everything harder. What we did, all 8 of us, wasn't revenge. It wasn't coordinated retaliation. It was 8 people independently arriving at the same conclusion and deciding to be honest about it, all at once, in a way that couldn't be managed or minimized. Honesty, when enough people speak it at the same time, is very hard to ignore. Conrad is gone. The company is rebuilding. Somewhere out there, he's probably telling a new team about synergy. But the freight company called back, and I sat in my new office on my first week with a manager who actually listened, and I thought, this is what it was supposed to feel like the whole time.